speaking of corridors of power, I think I would just like to start off the conversation with why the Constitution and why architecture. So I don't have an architecture background at all. And for me, spaces are definitely political in the way in which people interact with them and in also the way in which it makes you feel certain things. But that's basically my understanding of spaces in general. And I think what is really interesting for me is that at the end of the day, both the Constitution as well as space is political in nature, but in very different ways. And the way in which these two interact with each other or dialogue is also curious, and something that both Sanjana and Channa has taken on board is to navigate the complexities of that dialogue and then represent the manner in which they also understood the Constitution. So on that note, what I would first like to, I suppose, kick off with is why the Constitution and why architecture, why not something else?
Why is the Constitution? I think it's because Sanjana's interest in the Constitution, and I think the interest we must all have in a Constitution. And I have to say, until Sanjana came and really made certain challenges to me. Do you know that A, B, C, D about the Constitution? I always knew I knew the Constitution until Sanjana clearly pointed out that I really didn't. And so I felt, yes, the Constitution, because we must all know how we are governed, how we need to interact with each other, what are the frameworks that have been set out for us to live decently and reasonably as a society. And that's the purpose of the Constitution, so that we know how to engage with each other. So hence the Constitution. The idea of using architecture, I think Sanjana, you had used it before in a quite interesting way, which was much more representative or symbolic in nature, because architecture happens to work at different levels. As those who know architecture works at the level of symbolism, where you can look at something as an object and say, well, that symbolizes whatever. That's, for instance, like a stupa or something like that. You see it from a distance, and there is a symbolic notion of what everything means. Architecture most effectively and most effectively works at the level of spaces, and how spaces connect with each other, and what potential those spatial connections have for either bringing people together or keeping them apart. A lot of us don't think of architecture that way, but that's how it affects us as we move through these spaces that we navigate on a daily basis. So when Sanjana gave me his first lessons about the Constitution of Arika, I began to think, well, of course, these are about relationships. The relationship between first the three main orders of power, the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive. We all know that. But these are all nuanced in various different ways. And I felt, well, we can work perhaps in the way different spaces can be made to represent each of these. I'm going to start with the three main things, and then later with the more subtle aspects of each of those separate items of centers of power, and then perhaps what those connections generate as a form can begin to represent what we see. And what Sanjana was trying to explain to me and trying to get me to do was to say, look, is it possible to make the relationships that are actually in the written word of the Constitution, which are actually quite intangible. They are only ideas that are floating there. Can we make them tangible? And I think that was, on the whole, what we were trying to do. And what you see represented in front of us are first, I think, the first Republican Constitution of 1972, when Sri Lanka decided to have a Constituent Assembly at the Navarangahala at Royal College and declared a republic. It was what we call a constitutional coup, which kicked out the Queen of England, or the Queen of Ceylon then, as our head of state, and put a president in his place. And for me, the model represents, I mean, we can go into it deeper, but represents that moment. The next model in front of me here shows the point at which we decided that we needed to have a little bit more control on us, and we agreed that we might have a presidential constitution of 1977 or 78. So that's the second Republican Constitution of 1978 represented in the second model, where you begin to see certain changes. There's a sort of overwhelming attitude to it. And then we have here two other, Sanjana and Asanga, in their wisdom, thought might be two other key moments in constitutional history. I have to say it's quite extraordinary that the 1977 Second Republican Constitution has stood for so long. It has really been almost 50 years now, or whatever, and it's been our constitution. But of course we've had drastic changes. And the model right in front of me here represents the 13th Amendment, which was a very, very significant moment in the history of our country. In 87, yes, the 13th Amendment. And the one right at the end is the 19th Amendment, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, which I think was another very, very important moment, and even now to live, the country may have had a different perspective on how we would govern.
Sanjana, well, we spoke. This is not the first time that you engaged in this kind of exercise. So your previous engagements, did they in any way inform, or how did they inform this process? Because you experimented a little bit with architectural models, is that right? In terms of the constitution, represent the constitution? Okay. Just in terms of what was the precursor to the corpus of law?
Well, for me, the burning or the irksome question has been how to engage people in Sri Lanka around this document which governs all of us. And it's a difficult, abstract, as Channa said, it's this thing that everybody knows exists and doesn't want to say hasn't read, but doesn't also quite understand the principles and the powers and what is actually enumerated in that document. And so that was then, in 2012, the starting point for collaboration between Sunil Jayawardena, the architect and artist, and Asanga and I, at the Saskia Fernando Gallery, when she invited me to kind of curate an exhibition called Mediated. And there was a diptych there that represented Sunila's interpretation of Asanga's invitation by me to represent the problems of the Constitution at the time, before the 18th Amendment was envisioned by my colleagues. That followed then another exhibition to commemorate the 30th year after Black July, the anti-terrorist pogrom in 1983 July, for those of you who don't know. After 30 years, we had a large exhibition at the Park Street Museum, which had that space, which is now a restaurant. And then that was then another moment where Asanga, Sunil and I kind of envisioned a kind of very different way that resulted in a triptych that was a timeline of the evolution of the Constitution since 1977. But that was more in pictorial form, not in any kind of model. So there weren't any models till the corridors of power. And the reason I got to talk with Channa is that this was then, after those two attempts, I really wanted a spatial interrogation of the Constitution and the 43 years of our constitutional evolution. It's never been done before, ever, anywhere in the world. And part of, there's a lot to talk about it, but just to say that these four models aren't the entire exhibition, and it's kind of difficult for Channa and I to see just the four models, because the entire exhibition had schematics, blueprints, 3D models in terms of rendering that was presented and projected on an LCD screen, as well as a lot of other write-ups, and including some, Channa, if you remember the Revit error message. So there was like fascinating stuff that arose as a consequence of the project, and we can talk about that a bit later. So it was a very large exhibition. It's a real distillation of what you see here in terms of just the four models. But the reason that drove this was I wanted to see a physical expression and interrogation of what at the time was a journey leading to corridors of power that wanted to bring to the public consciousness a way in which you could really grasp the Constitution, and for me, importantly, not in a partisan manner. So this actually was envisaged. Everybody thought that when this launched in 2015 that it was in celebration of the Sirisena presidency. In fact, we started at a time when it wasn't even conceived of. The project started at the time of hyper-presidentialism, as what is called now, after the 18th Amendment, but there was actually no hope of anything more than or beyond or apart from the 18th Amendment and what that would have resulted in. 2015, January 8th was a complete accident, and it just happened to be the case that we had been working on it for over a year. So when it actually opened, everybody thought it was a celebration of the Sirisena presidency. It was not the case. So, that's kind of like a brief history, and an incomplete one, of how COP came to be.
Thank you for that overview. I think that's really important in terms of understanding why, for example, there are four models here. This is part of a much larger whole, and the absence of that larger whole also informs the way in which we look at these models as well. So, just in terms of, just to go back to the point of speaking to Channa, Channa, you spoke about how Sanjana asked you several questions to which you didn't know the answer to.
Well,
Could you explain
there were
how
a
that
whole
conversation
lot of them. It's about, do I really know what the relationship between the three main centers of power are? What are the subtleties of those relationships? We assume that there is a Supreme Court, we assume there's a Parliament, and we have a President. How are each of these things sort of controlled by the other and so on? Were things I wasn't really very clear about, or in fact, the notion I had was perhaps the wrong one, and Sanjana clarified a lot of them. So because I took the attitude that, and that's where I think the plans are very important, because the plan is in many ways a representation of the connections between different spaces. And for me, because I took that position of architecture being most effective at the level of how spaces connect or not connect, or deliberately are made not to connect and so on, understanding that relationship was important. So we had long conversations, which I call my yellow paper drawings, which I used to have this sort of roll of yellow canary paper and I keep scribbling on it. And I remember Sanjana saying, no, not like that and not like this and so on, until we came to some kind of understanding where even he from the plan understood, yes, that's the relationship between the legislature and the judiciary, and that's the relationship between the presidency and the legislature and so on, as a series of spaces that were connected in a particular way, how you could move from one space to another, could you see through from one space to another, could you see through a space or was the space opaque? All of those things came to play in my trying to understand the Constitution as a series of relationships. And as I came on to understanding that, I then kind of said I had to choose some kind of vocabulary to express this. And of course, I've chosen the vocabulary that my old guru Jeffrey Bauer used for Parliament itself. And it could have been any shape and form. The roof could have been concrete, the roof could have been anything. But at a specific moment, I chose that particular vocabulary of architecture to wrap up the spaces that I had made. Very simply because that would be something that people in our country could connect to. Here is the vocabulary which has been used in the legislature of our country, which I began to use to connect up the spaces. So what you actually see out here is only a 3D manifestation, an outward manifestation of a whole series of imagined connections that are inside it. And that's where I think when we had the full exhibition with all the drawings and these wonderful Revit models that we made, which were moving around and so on, you had a greater understanding of what was going on. But in many ways, this is what we also wanted to do, and I think what Sanjana wanted to do was to see how is it that there is a tangible representation of the Constitution. And if you look at that, you begin to see that there's a certain simplicity and an order in the First Republican Constitution. I'm not saying it was perfect. There were lots of imperfections. In fact, imperfections in words, he pointed out to me, that began in the First Republican Constitution. has now become like, this is it, there is no other, it is the right thing to say. So although it looks very simple, it has a certain complexity within it. And the second one begins to tell you about the inflation of the executive.
And the introduction.
And the introduction. The introduction was one thing, and we introduced an inflated executive. And you begin to see the roof floating out, overwhelming almost the legislature that's below. Now, earlier in the morning, you asked me, what's that little object sticking out? And that, I think, is, for me, represents the one thing that we can perhaps still look to, which is the judiciary. I know there have been moments where the judiciary itself has been compromised, but I always still felt, and I think Sanjana agreed with me at the time, that yes, it needs to be separate, it needs to be seen to be separate. And I felt, yes, that was one of the few things that had a clear relationship between the legislature and the presidency or the executive. Although as the executive inflates in the second model, it begins to slowly impinge on the judiciary as well. And by the time of the 19th Amendment, the 18th Amendment, I keep saying 19th, but the 18th Amendment, it gets overwhelmed by everything. And the executive is what appears to be the most important and key element. And that's really the idea of how I feel the idea.
But you also had the 19th
we had a 19th as a drawing, as a sort of blueprint, and that one, I didn't have the time to model it at the time because we had certain deadlines.
But it was the concept embryonic as well.
Yes,
so we couldn't.
and we didn't know exactly what was finally going to be passed, so we just did it as a drawing of what we thought it might be, and in the main exhibition that appeared as a blueprint on the wall, which of course also was very kind of symbolic of what was happening at that moment. And for me, the greatest sort of pleasure, and well, I wouldn't say pleasure, for me, like I was humbled by a person at the first exhibition, and the gentleman was blind. And he actually went around touching these. And he kind of came up to me and said, I think I know what you're trying to say. By comparing through touch each of these objects, obviously he doesn't see any of the tiny detail. He began to kind of understand, yes, this is perhaps the transformation that has happened from 72 to 1980. And for me, that was really very humbling to think that, yes, even though I approached it from the inside, which was about relationships, about space, and then used a particular vocabulary to represent it as an object, there was somebody who could not see it, but by just feeling what it felt like, get an idea of what those changes must have been. And I felt we were kind of vindicated and validated in the fact that, yes, perhaps people can engage. And I see a lot of people looking at these objects and saying, what is this? And I think that's exactly what we want. We want people to say, what is this? And then say, well, let me see, let me read the Constitution and see if it really is that what it's representing. Is that what we're talking about? And I think for me, that would be really what I want. I may not have got it right, but at least it will make people begin to question and to try and understand how we all sort of, the framework within which we negotiate with each other.
Yeah. Yes. So there were two other stories actually. There was so I joined the Curators tour, and at the end of one tour, there was a mother with about, at the time, her son was about the age of my son, who was about 12. And so this guy was really interested in it, and so the mother was very silent, so I went up to him and said, what do you think about the models? And he paused for a bit and said, it's really cool. I said, what's cool about it? It's like Quake. And for those of you who don't know Quake, it's like this 3D shoot 'em up where you go kill the aliens and you navigate the structure. And I know that was fascinating for me because I played Quake actually. So I was like, okay, fine, that's cool. So then I took him to the 18th and I said, what do you think about that? And he said, that's he said, that would be an interesting level. And I said, yeah, it would be an interesting level. But what do you find interesting about it? He said, there's much more space to play around. But I said, okay, fine, that's cool. So I said, imagine that concrete structure on top of your Mars house. And I said, what do you think is going to be that level? What do you think is going to happen to the building underneath? And then he came, paused for a bit, and he said, Mars house is going to collapse. Ma's house won't be able to hold the weight. And I said, that's the problem with the kind of government we have, where the president has too much of power. And then he said, that's not good, is it? And I said, no, that's not good, and I think you need to think about that. And the mother then he went on, the mother came up to me and said, listen, this project needs to be in schools. Because you have explained to my son constitutionalism in a way that schools don't teach. The pedagogy can't accommodate, and the syllabi just don't even remotely embrace. Yeah? So that was like a fascinating moment. The second story is actually, I won't mention the name, but somebody now again in government, very high up with the current president, was then also just out of power, as you can imagine, with the citizen presidency, and then came to the exhibition 3 times. Because in the duration of the week that we launched it, we had every day something that was discussed on around of it. And I must say that in that week, one of the keynote speakers talked about federalism in this country for the first time in public after a decade. So this exhibition kind of opened up that space for the interrogation of constitutional reform as well. But this gentleman came and said, Sanjana, the third day, he was very quiet the first 2 days, third day he came up to me and said, and I knew that he was part of the regime, and there was no judgment there. And he said, listen, I'm so glad he did this, which kind of shocked me, because I thought he would be defensive about the fact that it was his president who brought about the 18th. And he said, absolutely not, and I'm so glad that he did this, because even for people like me, and people from government, this is instructive and educational in the instability and the unsuitability and the complete inanity of what actually we supported. And this is done in a way where you're not judging us, you're telling us, and you're inviting us to a conversation. So those 3 stories, from the blind to the young, from the old to also the students, and also for me it was somebody who was embedded and entrenched in the Rajapaksa administration, who was able to access this. And that's why I would say it out loud, I'm quite proud of the project for being able to kind of bring in people from extremely different political convictions and dispensations into a conversation that otherwise would be colored by a way in which keeps them out.
And that's where that initial question that you asked about architecture and why architecture is that by simply interrogating the Constitution as a series of relationships, which you as a lawyer would probably see in the written word, and then sort of almost kind of independently trying to represent that in spatial sequences, and then simply simply making those spatial sequences with a common vocabulary of architecture, it somehow manages to be not say non-critical, non-partisan. So it is just an interrogation of what is there. Here is what the written word is. This is the sort of relationship there is, and spatially you can get that relationship drawn up first as a plan, and then made using a particular vocabulary of architecture, and here's the product. It's not like I'm thinking, oh God, this person is a horrible person, therefore I must represent it symbolically in this way.
Which was tough for you though, right?
Which was tough. I mean, it's very easy to, being sort of reasonably liberal myself, it's very easy to get, yes, exactly. It's very easy to take on an aesthetic and make it symbolic. And you can get seduced by that, because that's an easy way out. But to hold on to, really try to hold on to the relationships themselves, and for the object to come out of those sets of relationships was a difficult one. And I'm talking to this man, he's like, he also has his huge biases, which is not gently in the conversation. I mean, it's not like you're deliberately saying it, but the way
I was very conscious about what I was But actually, the joy of the year, I mean, it was a year in the making. I used to go to MICE and we used to spend, good 2 hours, Channa, sketching, and then I am, on the sofa, and then, I wish that could be captured, because that is an absolutely high point of my life, actually, to kind of see the evolution of it. And those sketches were also part of the exhibition, because that was actually the foundation of the conversation. For safekeeping. And that was also part of it, because it was important to kind of show how this came about. that it just didn't immediately result in these 4 models. I mean, there was a conversation over a year, which was really quite tough. Sorry, may I just interject and take over? I mean, do you want to talk about the Revit example? Because it's not here, and I think that's really fundamental in how the software brought up errors in the structure that it became an interrogation of political.
I am not the expert in Revit, I have to admit. I mean, I am not, in fact, I can't do a computer modeling of building to save my life. Because I'm one of those last generation who actually do by pencil, and I skipped to something called an iPad, which you can sketch and send things to people. But we do have an office, and we do have a lot of very, very clever young people who do these models. And one of them, I got all these models, all these sets of spaces and buildings modeled on a program called Revit. Now, of course, the thing with Revit is that if everything doesn't fit to support something, it just simply says error. It just doesn't work.
It's good to
now, with a lot of programs, you can get away with it. I mean, even with a hand drawing, you can get away with it. You can pretend that something somewhere is holding it up. But with Revit, it's literally like building that actual building. There are lots of bits and pieces that have to be often what you don't see. As my old guru Jeffrey used to say, what you don't see is often more important than what you see. So in Revit, it's like every bit and piece must be in place for this object you're trying to make to say it's fine. And it kept on, when we were doing the 18th Amendment, it kept on coming up as a series of errors because it wasn't possible to truly support some of those ideas, those relationships that resulted in the object that it is. So what's in the model really is I think there are some points at which we've supported it with other means which are not structurally conducive if you were actually building it.
So I just have a question. Is it only the 18th Amendment model that?
Yes.
Yeah, that was the worst case scenario. The others somehow had a certain sensibility. I mean, if you look at the 13th Amendment, yes, it was really about trying to decentralize government. But unlike, of course, what we were thinking of, what one would think of as true decentralization, where power comes from below, you had a situation in which this was power sort of held out to people and said, why don't you use a bit of this? And that's why it's represented as a series of little cranes. And this other reason for it, of course, was what Sanjana pointed out early in the morning, was that if you look at the underneath, inside the acrylic cover, there's a kind of slope. And we felt, and then we kind of had this notion, in fact, all of these turned that way would probably be more. And this notion that the ground wasn't always entirely firm. And in those situations, you had to have cranes to hold the power up because there was no support from below. And that's what we tried to show as well. In certain situations, you did not have that support. So you had to have it suspended from above, which was part of the reason, of course, that whole exercise of the 13th Amendment just hasn't worked for us. It is only, think about the politics of the provincial councils, it's only created another layer of corruption as far as I'm concerned, or opportunities for it. Because it doesn't really touch the ground, it doesn't really come from below. And that is there, but because we then said, look, it can be suspended, it can be held this way, the model worked. So there was a sensibility in it that made it possible. Whereas the other one, there were lots of errors which really were not supportable. So what we've done in the model is to just simply support it through other means. But if you look at the plans carefully, you'll find disjunctions. And an architect will find it, and will probably find it and say, really, Channa, this is stupid, this not work. I would probably get a D or something like that if that were in architecture school for that one.
And since we're talking about architecture, an architecture vocabulary, so to speak, that you had to really develop in order to represent it this way. And we were also working with Ashoka and also Sanjana, coming at it from different disciplines, different angles, so to speak. It's not an easy thing to do to put those things together, especially when you don't have a common vocabulary to speak. So you spoke about it being a high point for you to sit down with Channa.
Because I was negotiating those things.
Exactly. So how was that experience? How did you actually manage to, I mean, it's a very difficult question, but it's also an interesting negotiation that you have to make in order to come to this kind of output.
I mean, I don't know, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I thought the conversation worked. As I said, there's nothing like this that had been done. You know, you hadn't had this kind of conversation before. It helps that Channa is somebody very easy to work with when you kind of deal with the issues at a conceptual level. So Asanga basically gave us the framework to anchor our interrogation to. Channa brought in the architectural aesthetic and that discourse. I kind of tried to maintain a fidelity to Asanga's initial framework of interrogation, Channa's architectural expression, and my vision of a project that allowed people to access the Constitution. And, you know, it wasn't as if there was a tussle for a hierarchy. None of us were trying to prove to each other that we had the final word or say. It really was a conversation. And as I said, I wish that there was a way in which those conversations at MICD, Channa's office, could be recorded or had been recorded, because that was for me also fundamentally interesting as a way in which you kind of ended up with corridors of power.
Is there an example that you can maybe give us of that negotiation?
I wish I brought the sketches along with me, but that I think the sketches are the encapsulation of those.
I think in many ways, the moment we agreed that architecture was also about relationships, I keep saying this, but then the conversation became, when he understood that architecture is really about spaces and relationships, and what you manipulate as an architect is space and those relationships that you set up between them. The moment he understood that, he was then able to interpret Asanga's kind of very pedantic notions of what a constitution was to me, which I wouldn't have particularly understood on my own. Because, I mean, I don't have a legal mind and so whatever. So he was able to then interpret those aspects that Asanga was talking about as a series of relationships, which I could then, so we kind of found that common language of relationships, which he could then take from the Constitution, and I could take from architecture and say, how do we put this together?
But in the curator's note, I tried to also tell you, I had a rough idea that I wanted architecture because I had envisioned the relationship between the center and the periphery to be one of long corridors. And I wondered how long the corridor would be, what the width of the corridor would be, whether it would be tight and whether you could really tight and not be able to negotiate the corridor, whether it would be a vast space where there would be free flow, how thick the walls would be it be airy, would it be, you know, translucent and transparent? I mean, so that was kind of what I had maybe as a like very, very much more basic structure, but it was in a sense what I wanted to see at the end in terms of the models. And so then through Channa's conversations, it became much more nuanced and refined. And as I said, it really was a conversation where that initial kind of idea was refined into what you see here.
Just in terms of also how you represent certain things. So for example, I think the judiciary is sticking out somewhere.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, all of them actually.
Yeah,
but less so.
Yes.
That's also quite conscious.
Exactly. So why is it? If I remember, it's circular.
It's a circular model. It's again symbolic to the extent that, so that's where symbolism comes in. The spatial notion inside, and if you look at the plans, they are somewhere in these catalogs. You'll see the real relationship between the legislature and how you can walk up a flight of steps or not, or you get blocked or not within the plan. And then one had to sort of look at an aesthetic that was totally different to the aesthetic I had chosen for the rest of the thing. Say, look, this is something that will remain distinctive and separate from the other two. The executive and legislature are usually in bed with each other in many ways. We know that. That's the way it happens. We see that whichever the majority controlling party in the legislature tends to go to bed with the executive. We see that happening in America at this very moment. But the judiciary somehow I felt needs to be represented in something has been something quite different. Where the real relationship, the spatial relationship was what mattered to me, that's seen in the plans. And then of course how this totally separate thing, even that could get overwhelmed by other elements as they begin to grow and become dominant.
Well, we have about 20 minutes to go, so I would like to, if it's okay with you, to maybe open it for questions if anybody has any questions, insights that you would like to add.
How did you make the rapid model work in the end?
It never worked.
We put it up as part
So
of
we
the-
had to put in, and I put other things in, which I wouldn't have aesthetically or
To
otherwise.
support,
Yes.
supports are not visible in this model.
Not all of them have been put in on the model. And as you know, these have traveled far, and some of them have actually fallen apart. The history of these models was that we made the first set of models for the first exhibition we had in 2015 by a group of young architects who worked with me. He's not here today, but and then they traveled the country. And for us, that was really so magical to have it in Jaffna, in Anurag, it went all over, and we had a series of drawings. The whole thing was done as a hook-up exhibition. We put it as triangles, and so they were completely destroyed at the end of it because we wanted people to touch it and feel it. And by the time we arrived, they came back to Lanka. They were in bits and pieces. And then Shamini decided that she must have them in her exhibition, and we made a new set of models for her, which went off to Dhaka, and then we know the drama of that journey, and we had to send people to reassemble them in Dhaka, and when they came back, they were equally sort of, they're very, very, very fragile models, and then we know that a few parts in resurrecting it, some of the parts I haven't been able to find. So you find that there are bits that, I mean, particularly on this side, that huge cantilever is only possible because it's a material which has greater strength per millimeter than if you actually had to do it in concrete. So in model it works, but not in, you have to really do it. It would be much more, and many more supports.
Other questions. In the process, at some point, did you think you maybe were overthinking the Constitution? So at every decision-making process, you kind of, both of you were taken back to think, okay, now we have to stop. So at some point, there's a certain aesthetic that has to come in and say, we get it, we got it, now we need to...
I think that's where we stop. You're absolutely right. I mean, I don't think this interrogates every tiny nuance of it. Well, for one, I mean, I don't think I had the capacity or intellectual capacity to do that. Sanjana probably did, and I think he really pushed me. But there came a point when you realize that, yes, I think this is representing enough of each of these aspects of the Constitution for us to make it obvious what it was all about. And yes, I mean, but I think we started with a bit of overthinking. That was really what we needed. Because we were thinking of it from a totally different perspective. Constitutions are written documents, and they are about language. And then we tried to say that, well, architectural language is about spatial relationships, and there are certain limitations that can represent language. I mean, not every word can be represented in spatial terms. So yes, that was the limitation of the entire conversation. And yes, we did overthink up to a point, and that was great fun, I have to say. Long hours of conversations that sometimes led nowhere. I think
A pleasure.
always pleasurable. I mean, Sanjana, I mean, I really do enjoy having chats with him because it makes you think, makes me think. But you know, sometimes you have to let those conversations happen and the overthinking to happen to really say, okay, this is where we stop. And you're right, we did stop at a point. I stopped at a point. I don't think Sanjana wanted to stop at a point, but I had to stop at a point because there are limitations to architecture.
Any other questions?
Well, the last model to shape why it created all the others are.
What happened was, in trying to understand the complexities of the executive.
The executive president. That's very the office of
The office of the president, which is the chief executive, and what was possible and what was not, and the corridors that led nowhere within it, and so on, could only for me be accommodated within a circular or non-rectilinear space. So I did this as a circle because it then sits neatly on the square, so that's my aesthetic judgment. It could have been any shape, but it couldn't be rectilinear because of all the twists and turns that we found appeared in the negotiations that were happening within the executive. So for instance, there were corridors that some people who were within the executive could never reach the end of and never get to the center. And there were others which led directly to the center. So that all those sort of twists and turns had to be accommodated in a non-rectilinear form, because the rectilinear forms had certain limitations of what you could and couldn't do in terms of relationships, whereas the circular form allows for much more complex arrangements. And that is, so in many ways, I think you do need to see the plan of the inside of that object to understand why that object happens as it is. And then perhaps at the back of my mind there might have been some kind of symbolic notion as well, where a circle dominates the square. And somehow becomes much more centric and more solid in its position. And if you look at sort of really powerful shapes, religious shapes, for instance, like a stupa, or like a lot of these places, they are circular and therefore centric and overwhelming. But the reason for it is much more the internal organization.
Also, just to, because this is something that you mentioned, when you look at the first and the last model, in terms of how the public could have perhaps interacted with. Yeah, exactly. Could you just maybe explain, because that's quite
Well, I mean, very simply, the models become more and more complex as you can, and denser. So one of the ironies of this is that if you start at 1977 with the introduction of the executive presidency for the first time, you have this office which becomes a monstrosity by the time of the 18th Amendment. And I think Jayawardena very famously said that the only thing that he couldn't do as executive president was to make a man into a woman and a woman into a man, and that was in the 80s. Long before what we kind of try to capture here is what is called hyper-presidentialism, which is a kind of power really that no other constitution in the world had really. The amount of power centered in this one office as executive president in Sri Lanka had no parallel in constitutionalism, really. The closest you could get was with the ancient kingdoms, and a very, very different way of negotiating and organizing society and polity. So one of the things that happened is that, in 1972, you could, as the public, we wanted it to be easy to see what was happening within, i.e. accountability and scrutiny, and then also for those within, as representatives of the people, to be able to see us, the citizen. And that over time gets completely eroded. So actually, again, you have to really go through the schematics and the drawings to understand this, but it becomes a catacomb where, for me, what Channa's visualization, what Channa brought to life was, when you come to the 18th, you are a prisoner of your own power. You really have no opening to see the outside world. You are a king and probably surrounded by every imaginable luxury and power and authority that you can kind of generate, but you are completely isolated, not just from the outside, but from within. You really don't have a connection. And that really was an expression of what the presidency was at the time, which is an office surrounded by those who would want to support it and get something out of it, but not really communicate how fragile an office it really was. So that really was the evolution of the structure as well to become less and less and less and less transparent.
So you'll see that from the lighting, if you look at the models, that really glows, and then there's a reduction in the glow, and finally you hardly see the light at the end. So putting the lights in was to give that sense of transparency, disappearing into opaqueness in its relationship with the outside.
Did those hours of conversation that Buffalo had result in what you would have thought would be an ideal model? In your opinion?
No, I don't think even the first one was ideal. I mean, from his point of view, as I understand.
No, but it's an interesting question. I mean, because
yes,
you would,
that's
you know, but I mean, for me, one way of so the architect and the idea would be very different from the tableau and the template and the landscape of the rear. What we were dealing with was not an abstract, hypothetical piece of land, and we treated the land that what Channa treated as the land or the foundation was actually the evolution of the constitution. I mean, over 3 years. So this was not some hypothetical thing that we had conjured up. So, I mean, for us, for Asanga and I think more so than for Channa, it was certainly not ideal. This was a slow burn into what then Sri Lanka became. So at no stage was this idea. At every stage is an interrogation of how far away from the idea the reality was, and how we could never grasp that which needed to be done in a constitutional expression to capture the potential of this country. So we were moving further and further away from the idea. So for us it was not ideal. But another way of looking at it is that the final product of COP was for me ideal as an entry point or a doorway into the conversations that we are having now. So that's what I'm saying. I mean, we're dealing with a non-ideal evolution and history, but the entry point into interrogating it in ways that the conversations never had happened before, I think it's ideal, and that's all because of China. But as an architect, I don't know whether you have a different take on the models.
I don't think I would build any of these things. Because, I find some of them positively ugly and not to my taste.
Yeah.
So that's a whole other conversation about what they look like.
But we had that conversation. Because I said that some of this was too ugly.
Yes.
And
So our sort of refined sensibilities will not allow us to probably to envisage building anything like this. And that's true. I mean, that's a whole other conversation about taste and where that comes from and how that is represented in objects and things that we make. But for me, it was an abstract exercise in trying to translate one language into another, which is the language of words and constitutional conversation into the language of architecture. And it didn't matter for me whether I liked it or not. It was nothing to do with what I liked. It was to do with a language and how it represented another set of ideas in a written word in 3D form. So for me, it was trying, and yes, of course, I mean, I think there's unconsciously all architects will bring some kind of taste to play, and my choice of vocabulary, for instance, was that. I mean, but that's probably the only point at which I kind of put my foot down and said, well, I will take that vocabulary because it's vocabulary I can deal with, I can live with. But what it ended up being was not something that I would be totally happy with as an architect.
Well, yeah, just a quick question, maybe we have a few more minutes. So,
Channa, I was just curious about when Baba did this, put this thing in the middle of water.
Are you talking of Parliament?
The real part.
The real part.
Just to change tack a little bit.
Yes.
Surrounded,
Yes.
isolated.
Yes.
And you talk about spaces of connectivity. Did you
Yes.
actually maybe realize that these fellows have no relevance?
No, I always think, I mean,
go there. It's completely nothing to do with us. The space,
So we know
Parliament and the road and the playground where people play cricket. It's just a green pit. And you drive by the old parliament with the hustle and bustle of the city, and
Yes.
you're our representative.
Yes.
Now he takes them and puts them in this magnificent palace. Can you
Floats them
imagine
out
what
into the
happens
water
there?
and
The
says,
bloody fellow goes in there, he thinks I am now a very special person. So I wonder why he did that.
I have this theory that, I mean, okay, 15 years after he's gone, we can talk about it much more easily. There was a question, I think some of you were here, they were there at one of these Wednesday chats that the architects have from time to time, and there was a question from a journalist, a friend of mine, who said, oh, but look at Jeffrey Bauer and his buildings and his all these corridors and stuff like that at the University of Ruhuna. And if you really think about it, the corridors are the places where people meet and organize themselves. And in many ways, the University of Ruhuna has seen more protests than any other place in this country. So I sort of suggested to him that in many ways, although Jeffrey Bauer was seen as an architect who was only concerned with beauty and the picturesque, and if you take Parliament, that's exactly where it falls. Part of the whole picturesque story in architecture. You float something into the water, distant palace, sort of surreal beauty, and these endless corridors at the University of Ruhuna. But what did they actually do? I mean, I think he was far more intellectual than we give him credit for. And in many ways, the University of Ruhuna created these spaces in which students could talk with each other and exchange their ideas, and perhaps allowed them to be free in many ways out of the space of learning. There's almost a third of the area is corridors. And those are really the spaces in which most of the students learn at that university. Of course, we hate the idea that university students get together and protest and do all of these things, but the whole point is there's freedom of thought that is allowed within those open spaces. Similarly, I have a feeling when he was asked to build Parliament, and I think in many ways the island was partly fait accompli. I think it was sort of, obviously marshland, which the government had decided to take the capital city to, and Dua Island was already part of Dua, and there was marsh around it, so yes, here is a fantastic opportunity. And I'm sure he giggled and imagined that, yes, let's keep these irrelevant people quite irrelevant. Let them be a part floating out there. And I'd like to, I'm sure there was some thought about that. And was very clear about it. Of course, other sort of conversations and writings about Parliament give lots of other credit to him. One for creating a vocabulary. I remember sort of as a school kid, people talking about Parliament. Japan building, Japanese building. But what he was actually doing was he was stripping South Asian architecture, South Asian architectural vocabulary of all its symbolic notions, so that it could hopefully represent all of us here, and not one culture or another. So yes, if you strip it down, it almost becomes Japanese, a sort of wabi-sabi kind of situation. And that's what he was doing, and we know that there is very, very little cultural symbolism that is embedded in the architectural vocabulary. Yes, there are some paintings and so on within the chamber and all that, which may be said to be of one culture or another, but as a building, it is completely devoid of any of these symbolisms. It's got a sweeping roof, which was the idea of South Asian monsoon architecture. But I think these ideas there might have been something in it. Because I think we need to give him, and I think we haven't done enough research on all of this. Shanti Jayawardana's book begins to scratch the surface of his intellect. All the other books up to now have really been talking about the picturesque approach. Jeffrey Bauer did beautiful buildings, and therefore he was a great architect. I think he was a great architect for more than that. And I think there's a lot to be mined in trying to understand not just Bauer himself, but what that whole office and that whole practice did. And there's a lot to be spoken for.
I think that's a wonderful note to conclude today's talk. Speaking in terms of the architectural vocabulary that is there, I mean, the anecdotes that you referenced really indicates that there is clearly something very intuitive in the way that you have also developed that vocabulary. For someone who is not able to visually see it, to be able to touch it and have a sense of what you were trying to do is quite a credit to that process as well. And for me, coming from where I do come from, it's very easy within constitutional processes or also legal processes to become very desensitized to the kind of politics that we constantly discuss. So sometimes it's simply narratives, and I always found it very interesting that in law, narratives seem to just continuously lose power. So you have taken these verbal narratives, so to speak, or the words, and then visually narrativized it in a way that is visually represented to such an extent that someone who is in a position of power is now able to come take a look at it and then agree with the kind of representation that you have put out in a non-partisan way. So I think that is a very interesting way of translating some of the legal politics that are there that you don't always quite hear or are not very tangible for you as well as a citizen into something that is very visually represented. So thank you very much for Channa and Sanjana and for everybody who has come today to this talk. So on behalf of the MMC, I thank you all.